I was pulling weeds from my tiny tomato patch when I heard the sharp click of heels on my driveway. The August sun was already brutal at 7 in the morning, and sweat dripped down my back as I looked up to see Margaret Thornfield marching toward me with a clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "Excuse me, Ms. Rodriguez," she called out, her voice cutting through the desert air. "I need to speak with you immediately about this unauthorized agricultural operation you're running here." I sat back on my heels, wiping dirt from my hands on my old scrubs. Agricultural operation. I glanced at the modest raised bed I'd built against my garage wall, maybe 4 feet by 8 feet, holding 6 tomato plants, some basil, and a few pepper seedlings. My daughter Sophia had helped me plant them 3 months ago, right after I'd bought this little ranch house in Saguaro Hills. "I'm sorry, what?" I stood up, my knees protesting after 12 hours in the ER the night before. "These are just some vegetables for my family." Margaret's perfectly styled blonde bob didn't move, despite the desert wind that was already picking up. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks like she was heading to a board meeting instead of prowling the neighborhood at dawn. Her pale blue eyes swept over my garden with the kind of disgust most people reserved for roadkill. According to the Saguaro Hills Homeowners Association Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, Section 4.7, Paragraph C, no resident may engage in agricultural activities on their property without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. She clicked her pen and made a note. "This is a clear violation. Agricultural activities." I couldn't help but laugh. "Margaret, it's 6 tomato plants. My neighbors have bigger herb gardens on their windowsills. The size is irrelevant. The covenant is quite specific about maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our community. This neighborhood was designed to showcase the natural beauty of the Sonoran Desert, not to resemble some truck farm." The way she said truck farm made it sound like I was growing meth in my backyard. I felt my temperature rising, and it wasn't just from the sun. "Look, I work 60 hours a week at Phoenix General. When I get home, I like to garden with my daughter. It helps us both unwind and we get some fresh vegetables. I'm not exactly threatening property values here." Margaret's mouth pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Property values are exactly what's at stake, Ms. Rodriguez. When one homeowner decides the rules don't apply to them, it creates a domino effect. Soon we'll have basketball hoops in driveways, boats parked on lawns, and who knows what other improprieties." "Improprieties? They're tomatoes, Margaret. They're not even visible from the street." "That's beside the point. The covenant is clear, and as a member of the HOA board, I have a duty to enforce our community standards." She tore a yellow carbon copy from her clipboard and held it out. "This is your official notice of violation. You have 14 days to remove the unauthorized vegetation and restore the area to its natural state." I stared at the paper, reading the formal language that made my little garden sound like some kind of environmental disaster. A fine of $50 per day would begin accruing after the 14-day period. For growing food in my own backyard. "This is ridiculous," I said, but Margaret was already walking away, her heels clicking triumphantly on the concrete. That evening, Sophia found me sitting at our kitchen table staring at the violation notice. At 16, she had inherited my stubborn streak and my inability to back down from a fight, especially when it involved something we'd built together. "Mom, what's wrong? You look like someone died." I handed her the paper. "Mrs. Thornfield says we have to destroy our garden." Sophia's dark eyes flashed as she read. "Are you kidding me? We spent weeks building those beds, and the tomatoes are finally getting ripe." She flopped into the chair across from me. "Can she really make us do this?" "I don't know, Mija. I've never dealt with an HOA before." When I'd bought the house, the real estate agent had mentioned homeowner fees and some basic rules, but I'd been so focused on finding a safe neighborhood with good schools that I hadn't paid much attention to the fine print. "This is so stupid. Mrs. Chen has roses all along her fence, and Mr. Valdez has that huge bougainvillea that's probably way bigger than our tomatoes. Those are decorative plants. Apparently that's different." Sophia stood up abruptly. "I'm going to look up this HOA thing online. There has to be something we can do. While she disappeared into her room with her laptop, I walked out to the back patio and looked at our little garden. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, some still green, but others starting to blush red. The basil was thriving in the desert heat, and the pepper plants were covered in tiny white flowers. We'd spend evenings out here together, Sophia telling me about her day while we watered and pruned and planned what we'd cook with our harvest. The next morning I found Margaret's white Mercedes parked in front of my house at 6:30 a.m. She was standing on the sidewalk taking pictures of my garden with a camera that looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. "Good morning, Margaret," I called out as I grabbed my newspaper. "Getting an early start on neighborhood surveillance?" She didn't look embarrassed at all. "I'm documenting the ongoing violation for the board meeting tonight. The photographic evidence will be helpful when we discuss enforcement actions." "Enforcement actions? Well, since you haven't begun compliance with the violation notice, we'll need to consider escalating measures. Perhaps a lien against the property or involvement of the County Code Enforcement Office." My stomach dropped. A lien could affect my mortgage, my credit score, everything I'd worked so hard to build since Sophia's father had walked out on us 3 years ago. "Margaret, can we talk about this reasonably? I'm happy to make some modifications if there's a compromise we can reach." "The time for compromise was before you violated the covenant, Ms. Rodriguez. Actions have consequences." She climbed back into her Mercedes and drove off, leaving me standing in my driveway in my scrubs, wondering how growing vegetables had turned into a threat to my financial stability. That afternoon I called in a favor and swapped shifts with another nurse so I could attend the HOA board meeting. It was held in the community center, a beige stucco building that matched every other structure in Saguaro Hills. About 20 residents had shown up, most of them retirees who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret sat at a folding table up front, with 2 other board members, Bob Hutchins, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, and Janet Palmer, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes. Margaret had changed into a black blazer that made her look like she was prosecuting a murder case. Item 7 on tonight's agenda. Margaret announced, shuffling through a stack of papers. Enforcement action regarding unauthorized agricultural activities at 1247 Desert Vista Drive. She held up an enlarged photo of my tomato plants like it was evidence in a criminal trial. Several neighbors turned to look at me and I felt my face burning. As you can see, the resident has established what can only be described as a vegetable farm in clear violation of our community covenants. This type of agricultural use is specifically prohibited to maintain the desert aesthetic that attracted us all to Saguaro Hills. Bob Hutchins leaned forward. "How large is this farm?" "Approximately 32 square feet," Margaret replied. "But the size isn't the issue. It's the precedent we set by allowing flagrant violations of our governing documents." Janet Palmer raised her hand. "Margaret, I drove by the property yesterday and honestly I thought it looked rather nice. The plants are well maintained and you can barely see them from the street." "That's not the point, Janet. If we allow one resident to ignore the covenant soon, we'll have—" "Excuse me," I said, standing up. "May I respond to these accusations?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "This is a board meeting, not a public forum." "Actually," Janet said gently, "residents have the right to address covenant violations that concern them. Please, Ms. Rodriguez, go ahead." I walked to the front of the room, my heart pounding. "Thank you. I'm Carmen Rodriguez, and yes, I have a small vegetable garden in my backyard. I planted it with my teenage daughter as a way for us to spend time together and to supplement our grocery budget. I work as an emergency room nurse, often 12-hour shifts, and gardening helps us both decompress from the stress of our daily lives." I looked around the room, seeing a few sympathetic faces. "I've read the covenants, and I understand there are rules about maintaining our neighborhood's appearance, but I believe there's a difference between commercial agricultural operations and a family growing their own food. The garden is small, well-maintained, and located behind my house, where it doesn't impact anyone else's property values or enjoyment of their homes." "The covenant makes no distinction about size or location," Margaret interrupted. "A violation is a violation. But surely the intent of the covenant was to prevent actual commercial farming or unsightly agricultural operations, I continued. My tomato plants pose no more threat to our community's aesthetic than Mrs. Chen's roses or Mr. Valdez's bougainvillea. Bob Hutchins cleared his throat. Those are ornamental plants, though. There is a distinction. Is there both provide beauty, both require maintenance, both could theoretically grow out of control if not properly managed. The only difference is that my plants happen to produce food instead of flowers. An older man in the back row raised his hand. "If I may," he said in a gravelly voice. "I'm Tom Morrison, been living here 12 years. I walk by Ms. Rodriguez's house every morning with my dog, and I've watched her and her daughter working in that garden. It's brought more life to that corner than it's had since the previous owners moved out. And if we're being honest, half the houses in this neighborhood have dead or dying landscaping because people can't afford to maintain desert plants in this heat. At least her garden is green and thriving." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd. Margaret's face was getting red. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your opinion, but we can't make covenant decisions based on sentiment. We have legal obligations to enforce the governing documents that all residents agreed to when they purchased their properties." "Then maybe the governing documents need to be updated," said a woman I didn't recognize. "I'm Sarah Kim. I just moved here from Minnesota. Where I come from, community gardens and home vegetable plots are encouraged because they build neighborhood connections and promote sustainable living. Punishing a family for growing their own food seems pretty harsh." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "We are not punishing anyone. We are enforcing the rules that maintain property values and community standards. If Ms. Rodriguez wanted to garden, she should have moved to a property without HOA restrictions." Or Janet Palmer said quietly, "We could consider whether our current interpretation of the covenants serves the best interests of our community." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Bob Hutchins spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing, Janet?" "I'm proposing we table this enforcement action pending a review of our agricultural restrictions. Perhaps we could form a committee to examine whether small-scale food gardening should be permitted under certain guidelines." Margaret's face was now the color of a ripe tomato. "We cannot simply ignore covenant violations because they seem sympathetic. What's next? Allowing backyard chickens, beehives, compost piles." "Maybe we should allow those things," said Tom Morrison. "My grandson lives in Portland and his neighborhood HOA encourages sustainable practices. They have community compost bins and shared garden spaces. Property values there are higher than they are here." "This is not Portland," Margaret snapped. "This is Arizona, and we have specific environmental challenges that require specific solutions. Allowing residents to plant whatever they want, wherever they want, will lead to chaos." "6 tomato plants," I said. "That's the chaos we're talking about. 6 tomato plants that my daughter and I planted together that we water with recycled dishwater that will produce maybe 30 pounds of food over the entire growing season." Sarah Kim stood up. "I'd like to make a motion that we table the enforcement action against Ms. Rodriguez pending a full board review of the agricultural restrictions in our covenants." "I second that motion," said Tom Morrison. Margaret looked like she might explode. "You can't just make motions from the floor. This isn't how board meetings work." Janet Palmer consulted a worn copy of Robert's Rules of Order. "Actually, residents can make motions that relate to covenant enforcement. It requires a majority vote of board members present to approve." "Then I call for a vote," Bob Hutchins said. "All in favor of tabling the enforcement action pending review?" Janet Palmer raised her hand immediately. Bob Hutchins hesitated for a moment, glancing between Margaret and the residents, then slowly raised his hand as well. Margaret's face was stone. "Motion carries 2-1. But I want it on record that I strongly oppose any weakening of our covenant enforcement." As the meeting broke up, several neighbors approached me with words of support. Tom Morrison shook my hand and told me his late wife would have loved my garden. Sarah Kim gave me her number and asked if I'd be willing to serve on the review committee. But as I walked to my car, I noticed Margaret talking intently on her phone in the parking lot, her voice too low to hear, but her body language radiating anger. 2 days later, I found another notice taped to my front door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the City of Phoenix Code Enforcement Division, informing me that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding unpermitted agricultural use in a residential zone, and that an inspector would be visiting my property within 5 business days. Sophia was furious when I told her. She called the city over tomatoes. "Mom, this is getting crazy." "I know, Mija, but we'll deal with it." I tried to sound more confident than I felt. City code enforcement was a different beast than the HOA. They had real legal authority, not just the ability to fine me or put a lien on my house. That weekend, I spent hours online researching Phoenix zoning laws and residential gardening regulations. The city code was dense and confusing, full of legal jargon about land use classifications and permitted activities. But buried in the residential zoning section, I found a provision that seemed relevant. Small-scale food production for personal consumption shall be permitted in all residential zones, provided such activities do not create nuisance conditions or violate health and safety regulations. I printed out the relevant sections and called the Code Enforcement Office Monday morning. "Code Enforcement, this is Rick. Hi, I'm Carmen Rodriguez. I received a notice about a complaint regarding my property, and I have some questions about the city's position on residential food gardening." "Hang on. Let me pull up your case. Rodriguez Desert Vista Drive. Yeah, someone called in about commercial farming in a residential area. It's not commercial farming. It's 6 tomato plants in my backyard for my family's use." Rick was quiet for a moment. 6 plants, that's it. That's it. Maybe 40 square feet total all behind my house. "Ma'am, unless you're selling produce or creating a public nuisance, small-scale food gardening is generally permitted in residential areas. Who told you it wasn't?" "My HOA. They're claiming it violates our community covenants." "Ah, well, that's between you and your HOA. The city doesn't enforce private covenant restrictions unless they conflict with municipal code, and growing tomatoes for your own use definitely doesn't violate any city regulations." I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in days. "So the anonymous complaint, I'll still need to come out and document that there's no code violation, but it sounds like this was someone trying to use the city to enforce private HOA rules. Happens more than you'd think." The inspector, Rick Gonzalez, showed up Tuesday afternoon. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and a relaxed manner that immediately put me at ease. "So this is the illegal farm operation I've been hearing about," he said with a grin as I led him to the backyard. "Behold my criminal empire," I replied, gesturing at the tomato plants. Rick walked around the small raised bed taking notes and photos. "These are nice plants. You know what you're doing. My grandmother would approve. She always said store-bought tomatoes have no soul. Is there any chance the city would consider this a violation?" "None whatsoever. You're well within your rights as a homeowner to grow food for personal consumption. Actually, the city has been encouraging urban agriculture as part of our sustainability initiatives." He handed me a business card. "If your HOA keeps giving you trouble, have them call me. I'll explain the relevant municipal codes." That evening, I called Janet Palmer and asked if I could address the board again at their next meeting. She seemed pleased to hear from me and said she'd been working on draft guidelines for small-scale gardening that might satisfy everyone's concerns. But before I could present anything to the board, Margaret escalated again. I was getting ready for work Thursday morning when I heard a truck rumbling in my driveway. Through the front window, I saw a large tow truck backing up toward my car, with Margaret standing on the sidewalk watching. I ran outside in my scrubs. "Hey, what are you doing?" The driver, a large man in a greasy coverall, looked up from his clipboard. "Got a work order to tow this vehicle. Unpaid parking violations." "Parking violations, I park in my own driveway." Margaret stepped forward with a satisfied smile. "Actually, according to the HOA covenants, vehicles must be parked completely within designated parking areas. Your car has been extending approximately 6 inches past the property line into the association's common area." I looked at my 10-year-old Honda Civic parked exactly where I'd been parking it for 3 months. 6 inches. The violation has been ongoing for weeks. The accumulated fines total $840, which triggers automatic towing provisions. The tow truck driver looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, is this your car? Yes, and it's parked in my driveway on my property. He glanced at Margaret, then back at me. Look, I don't know anything about HOA disputes. I just got a work order for unpaid fines. You'll need to take it up with whoever hired me. Wait, I said, my heart racing. Can I see the documentation for these alleged violations? Margaret produced another folder. 17 separate violations over the past 6 weeks, each documented with photographs and precise measurements. I flipped through the papers, seeing photo after photo of my car taken from different angles with red lines drawn to indicate where it supposedly crossed the property line. The measurements claimed my bumper extended between 4 and 8 inches into common area. Margaret, this is insane. Even if this were true, which I doubt, we're talking about the tiniest possible encroachment. Property boundaries are clearly defined for a reason, Ms. Rodriguez. Your continued disregard for community rules has forced us to take stronger action. The tow truck driver was hooking up my car. In 15 minutes, I needed to be at the hospital for a 12-hour shift. Without my car, I'd be stuck. Please, I said to the driver. This is my only transportation to work. I'm a nurse. He paused, looking genuinely sorry. Ma'am, I've got a contract with the HOA management company. If I don't complete the job, I don't get paid. I watched helplessly as my car was loaded onto the truck. Margaret handed me a bright yellow paper. Your vehicle will be released upon payment of all outstanding fines plus towing and storage fees. The impound lot opens at 8 a.m. As the truck drove away with my car, I felt something snap inside me. Margaret was still standing there with her clipboard, like she was savoring the moment. You know what, Margaret, you win. You want the tomatoes gone. Fine, I'll rip them out tonight. Her smile faltered slightly. That's the right decision, Ms. Rodriguez. But I want you to know that you're destroying something beautiful that my daughter and I built together. You're forcing me to teach her that bullies with clipboards and petty power can crush anything good in this world. My voice was shaking with anger. I hope whatever satisfaction you get from this is worth it. I called an Uber to get to work, spending $50 I couldn't afford on surge pricing. All day I was distracted and angry, snapping at colleagues and struggling to focus on patients. During my lunch break, I called the impound lot and learned that getting my car back would cost over $1,200, the accumulated fines, plus towing, plus daily storage fees that would keep adding up. Sophia was waiting for me when I got home that night, and she'd been crying. Mom, I looked up everything online. Mrs. Thornfield is lying about the parking thing. I found the actual property survey from when you bought the house. Your driveway goes all the way to the sidewalk. There's no way your car is parked on HOA property. She had printed out pages of documents, the original property survey, the deed, even aerial photos from the county assessor's website. Look, she said, pointing to the survey map. The property line is clearly marked here. Your parking space is completely on our land. I studied the papers, feeling my anger crystallize into something harder and more focused. Margaret hadn't just been enforcing rules, she'd been making them up. Mija, I think it's time we got serious about fighting back. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the hospital, Sophia and I drove to the downtown courthouse in her friend's car to file a small claims action against the HOA for wrongful towing and conversion of my vehicle. The court clerk, a woman about my age with tired eyes, looked over our paperwork. You're suing your own HOA. They towed my car based on false claims about property boundaries. I have a survey that proves my parking space is entirely on my own land. She stamped our filing. Good luck. I live in an HOA too, and those people can be ruthless. From the courthouse, we went to the impound lot. The manager, a gruff man named Eddie, looked over the property survey and whistled. If this is accurate, then the towing was improper, but I still can't release the vehicle without payment of the fees. Even though the towing was based on false information, I'm sorry, but I have a contract with the HOA management company. I get paid regardless of whether the underlying violation was legitimate. I paid the $1,200 with my emergency credit card, watching my debt climb to levels that made me sick to my stomach. but I also asked Eddie for copies of all the towing documentation, including the original work order and the contact information for whoever had authorized the tow. That afternoon, armed with a stack of evidence, Sophia and I went door to door in the neighborhood. We wanted to tell our side of the story before Margaret could spin the narrative. Tom Morrison invited us in for iced tea and listened carefully as I explained what had happened with the towing. "That's fraud," he said bluntly. "If your car wasn't actually violating anything, then they stole your car and extorted money from you to get it back." "I don't know if it rises to the level of fraud," I said, "but it's definitely not right." "Have you talked to other neighbors about Margaret's enforcement activities?" "Not really. I've been trying to handle this quietly." Tom laughed bitterly. "Quietly doesn't work with people like Margaret. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for 2 years, looking for violations like a hawk hunting mice. Last month she tried to fine the Kowalskis because their newspaper was delivered 30 minutes before the allowable time. Their newspaper, covenant violation for unsightly materials visible from the street. The paper boy comes at 5:30 a.m. and according to Margaret, newspapers can't be left visible until after 6 a.m. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking to neighbors, and the stories were eye-opening. Margaret had fined people for children's toys left on porches, for having patio furniture that wasn't approved colors for holiday decorations, that stayed up one day too long. The Chens had been cited for their roses being improperly pruned. The Valdez family had been threatened with liens because their teenage son's car was allegedly parked 6 inches over the property line, the same false claim she'd used against me. But what struck me most was that most people had simply paid the fines rather than fight. Margaret had created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that kept residents compliant. Sarah Kim was particularly helpful. As a recent transplant from Minnesota, she wasn't afraid of Margaret and had been documenting her own interactions with the board. "I've been keeping records of everything," she told us, pulling out a thick binder. "Margaret came to my house 4 times in my first month here looking for violations. She measured the height of my grass, the placement of my garbage cans, even the angle of my mailbox. When I asked to see the specific covenant language she was citing, she couldn't produce it. Why didn't you file a complaint with the board?" "She is the board, essentially. Bob Hutchins is afraid of her and Janet Palmer seems nice, but doesn't want to rock the boat. Margaret controls the agenda, the documentation, everything." That evening I called Janet Palmer at home. "Janet, this is Carmen Rodriguez. I wanted to follow up on the board's decision to review the gardening restrictions." "Oh, yes, Carmen, I'm so glad you called. I've been working on some draft guidelines that I think could work for everyone. Actually, I'm calling about a different issue. The HOA towed my car yesterday based on false claims about property boundaries." There was a long silence. "I'm sorry, what—" I explained what had happened and could hear Janet's sharp intake of breath. "Carmen, I had no idea about any of this. Margaret handles most of the day-to-day enforcement issues, and she told the board your car had been towed for repeated parking violations. She didn't mention anything about property boundaries." "Janet, I think there are a lot of things Margaret isn't telling the board." The next day was Saturday, and I was working in my front yard when Margaret's Mercedes pulled up to the curb. But this time Janet Palmer was with her, and both women got out. Margaret looked furious, but Janet approached me with concern written all over her face. "Carmen, I wanted to see for myself what's been happening. Could you show us exactly where you've been parking your car?" I led them to my driveway and pointed to where I always parked. Janet knelt down and examined the property markers embedded in the concrete. "Margaret, this parking space is clearly on Ms. Rodriguez's property. I can see the boundary markers right here." Margaret's face was turning red again. "The measurements I took were very precise. There's been ongoing encroachment into common areas." Janet stood up, brushing dust from her knees. "Margaret, where exactly is this common area you're referring to?" The area between the property line and the street." "You mean the sidewalk? That's city property, not HOA property." I pulled out my phone and showed Janet the photos Sophia had found on the county website. "These are the official property boundaries. You can see that my driveway extends all the way to the sidewalk." Janet studied the images, then looked at Margaret with something approaching disgust. Margaret, it appears you've been issuing violation notices based on incorrect information about property boundaries. The measurements were accurate, Margaret insisted. I used a professional-grade measuring device. But you were measuring from the wrong baseline, Janet said. Ms. Rodriguez's car was never parked on HOA property because there is no HOA property between her driveway and the street. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to have no answer. Janet turned to me. Carmen, I apologize on behalf of the board. This should never have happened. We'll be calling an emergency board meeting to address these enforcement issues. There's more, Janet, I said. Margaret has been using similar tactics against other neighbors. I think you need to review all of her recent enforcement actions. Margaret finally found her voice. This is a coordinated attack on legitimate board oversight. Ms. Rodriguez is trying to deflect attention from her own violations by making false accusations. Then let's review the documentation, Janet said calmly. I'd like to see the original work order for the towing, the photographs you used to determine property line violations, and any communications with the towing company. Margaret clutched her clipboard tighter. That information is confidential board business. Margaret, I'm also on the board, and as board treasurer, I have the right to review any expenditures, including payments to towing companies. The emergency board meeting was held Sunday evening in the community center, and this time, the room was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about the parking dispute, and residents came armed with their own stories about Margaret's enforcement actions. Janet Palmer had spent the weekend reviewing financial records and documentation, and her findings were damning. Based on my review of recent enforcement activities, she announced to the crowded room, I've identified several serious problems with how covenant violations have been processed. She held up a thick folder. First, regarding the towing of Ms. Rodriguez's vehicle. The work order was issued based on measurements taken from an incorrect baseline. Ms. Rodriguez's car was never parked on HOA property, making the towing unauthorized. A murmur went through the crowd. Margaret sat rigidly in her chair, staring straight ahead. Second, I've found multiple instances where violation notices were issued without proper documentation or board approval. Under our bylaws, any fine over $25 requires a vote of the full board, yet dozens of violations carrying $50 penalties were issued unilaterally. Bob Hutchins looked stunned. I wasn't aware of any of this. Because Margaret has been handling enforcement matters without bringing them to the board for review. Janet continued. Which brings me to the third issue, financial irregularities. She opened a ledger and began reading. Over the past 6 months, $14,800 in violation fines have been collected from residents. However, only $3,200 of those fines were properly voted on by the board. The remaining $11,600 appears to have been collected without proper authorization. Tom Morrison stood up. Where did that money go? Janet's face was grim. That's what we need to find out. Margaret finally spoke, her voice shaking with rage. This is a witch hunt. Every fine I've issued was based on clear covenant violations. If board members were too lazy to pay attention to enforcement matters, that's not my fault. Margaret, Janet said quietly, did you or did you not issue violation notices for parking infractions based on measurements from city sidewalks rather than actual property boundaries? The measurements were accurate. That's not what I asked. Were you measuring from property boundaries or from sidewalks? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Sarah Kim stood up. I'd like to make a motion for a full audit of all enforcement actions taken in the past year, and for the immediate suspension of any board member found to have acted outside their authority. I second that motion, called out Tom Morrison. Janet looked around the room. All residents in favor. Nearly every hand went up. Margaret stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. A forensic accountant was hired to review HOA finances, and every violation notice issued in the past year was examined by an independent attorney. The findings were worse than anyone had expected. Margaret had been operating like a personal fiefdom, issuing fines for violations that didn't exist, collecting money without board approval, and using her position to harass residents she disliked. The attorney's report documented over 40 instances of improper enforcement actions affecting nearly half the households in Saguaro Hills. But the most shocking discovery came when the accountant traced the path of collected fines. Margaret had been depositing violation payments into a separate account that she controlled, using the money to pay for enforcement consulting services provided by a company that turned out to be owned by her husband. Tom Morrison found me in my garden one evening watering my thriving tomato plants. "Thought you might like to know," he said with a grin. "Margaret submitted her resignation from the board this afternoon." I sat back on my heels, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Really? And get this, the board voted to reimburse all residents who paid improper fines. You should be getting a check for about $1,500. $1,500? Turns out she hit you with a bunch of violations you never even knew about. Late payment fees, administrative charges, processing costs, all completely made up. Sophia appeared from the house carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Did you tell her about the other thing?" Tom's grin got wider. The board also voted to officially approve small-scale food gardening under the new community sustainability guidelines. Your tomato patch is now the model for what other residents can do. I felt tears stinging my eyes. "I can't believe it's over." "It's not just over," Sophia said, settling down beside me in the dirt. "It's better. 3 other families have already asked for advice on starting their own gardens. That weekend, we had our first neighborhood garden party. 20 families brought dishes made with homegrown ingredients, and we shared seeds, tools, and advice about desert gardening. The Chens contributed roses for centerpieces. The Valdez family brought pepper plants to give away, and even Bob Hutchins showed up with herbs he'd been secretly growing on his windowsill. Janet Palmer, who had been elected as the new HOA president, made a short speech about community cooperation and reasonable enforcement. "We live in a beautiful neighborhood," she said, "and part of what makes it beautiful is when neighbors support each other instead of tear each other down." As the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I looked around at my neighbors, people who had become friends, allies, and fellow gardeners. Sophia was showing a group of kids how to identify ripe tomatoes, her face glowing with pride and purpose. Margaret's white Mercedes drove slowly past the community center, but she didn't stop. I felt a moment of sadness for her, wondering what had made her so angry and controlling. But mostly, I felt grateful for the community we'd built, for the courage we'd found to stand up to a bully, and for the simple joy of growing food with my daughter. 6 months later, Saguaro Hills was featured in a Phoenix newspaper article about neighborhood sustainability initiatives. The reporter interviewed several residents about our community gardens and the transformation of our HOA from an enforcement organization into a support network. "It started with one family growing tomatoes," Janet Palmer was quoted as saying, "but it became about so much more, about standing up for what's right, about neighbors helping neighbors, and about remembering that communities are built on cooperation, not control." The article included a photo of me and Sophia in our expanded garden, which now covered most of our backyard, and produced enough vegetables to share with elderly neighbors who couldn't garden themselves. We'd planted fruit trees along the back fence, installed a rainwater collection system, and created a small composting area that had become a neighborhood resource. But the best part of the article was a sidebar featuring quotes from residents about what they'd learned from the experience. Tom Morrison said it had reminded him that ordinary people could stand up to bullies and win. Sarah Kim talked about the importance of community engagement and not letting fear keep you silent. Even Bob Hutchins, who had initially been intimidated by Margaret, spoke about finding his voice and learning to advocate for his neighbors. My quote was simple: "Sometimes the best way to preserve your community is to be willing to fight for it." The reporter had asked if I had any regrets about the conflict with Margaret, and I'd thought carefully before answering. The truth was, I wished things could have been resolved differently without all the stress and expense and acrimony. But I didn't regret standing up for my right to garden, or for fighting back against unfair treatment, or for teaching Sophia that bullies with clipboards deserve the same response as any other kind of bully. A year after the towing incident, Margaret and her husband moved out of Saguaro Hills. Their house sold quickly to a young family with 3 kids who immediately asked the new HOA board for advice on installing a play set and starting a garden. Janet Palmer was delighted to help, and within a month their backyard was full of life and laughter. The ironies weren't lost on any of us. Margaret's obsession with property values and community aesthetics had nearly destroyed the very sense of community that actually makes neighborhoods valuable. Her rigid enforcement of arbitrary rules had created fear and resentment instead of the harmony she claimed to seek. And her abuse of power had ultimately led to exactly the kind of chaos and disorder she'd supposedly been trying to prevent. But the biggest irony was that our little vegetable garden, the supposed threat to Saguaro Hills' character and property values, had become the catalyst for creating a stronger, more connected, and more beautiful neighborhood than we'd ever had before. On summer evenings when Sophia and I work in our garden while neighbors stop by to chat and kids play in the street, I sometimes think about that first morning when Margaret appeared with her clipboard and her rules. I'm grateful she pushed us as hard as she did, because without that pressure, we might never have discovered how strong our community could be when it stood together. The tomatoes are bigger and sweeter now, and so is the sense of home. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.